Hello. Welcome to the CarbonAcademy module Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards. Now the EPC really matters. During this session, we'll be covering the following: energy efficiency legislation, the compliance requirements, the link between an EPC grade and asset value, and finally, how to make your EPC work for you. An Energy Performance Certificate, or EPC, gives a property an energy efficiency rating from A, most efficient, to G, least efficient. EPCs are required whenever a building is built, sold or rented. Now, the EPC is required to be produced prior to marketing in order that potential buyers or tenants can understand the performance of the property. The EPC contains information about a property's energy usage. It's accompanied by a recommendations report which offers some generic recommendations on improvements which can be made to the building to improve its energy performance. In Scotland, the EPC must be displayed within the property. EPCs can be searched for and downloaded from the Central Landmark Database. The EU Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, EPBD, became European law in January 2003, with a key objective of improving the energy performance of buildings through cost-effective measures. To meet its compliance objectives, the UK passed the Energy Performance of Buildings, Certificates and Inspections Regulations 2007 in England and Wales. These introduced the requirements for EPCs to be produced for all buildings from the first day of marketing. The EPC is valid for 10 years and provides a grade from A to G based on the estimated performance of buildings in terms of CO2 emissions. There's a legal requirement placed on the landlord, vendor and the agent to display the EPC grade and score on all property advertising, with fines from £500 to £5,000 for non-compliance. The EU recognised that energy required for heat and power in non-domestic buildings contributes significantly to its carbon footprint, and that the majority of existing buildings will remain in use well into the future. In the UK, energy for heat and power in non-domestic buildings stock equates to 12% of all UK emissions, and it's estimated that around 60% of today's non-domestic buildings will still exist in 2050. A key barrier to making efficiency improvements has been identified in relation to rented properties, in that it's often the case that the landlord's responsible for funding improvements in rented buildings, but it's the tenants that benefit from the lower energy bills. There was a need to trigger improvements in existing buildings, and so the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive was introduced. The UK passed the Energy Act 2011 in response to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive 2007. Part of the Act outlines the duty on the governments of the UK to implement minimum energy standards in the private rented sector. The energy efficiency regulations for private rented properties in England and Wales was enacted in 2015. It requires all domestic and non-domestic properties to have an EPC of E or above, in order to issue a lease to a new or existing tenant or have registered an exemption by the 1st of April 2018. By April 2023 for non-domestic and April 2020 for domestic, all private rental sector properties need to meet the minimum standard or have an exemption registered. Now, this means that it'll be unlawful to continue to let a property from these dates unless the building has an EPC with an E rating or above. Scotland has taken a different approach to this. It passed regulations in 2016, placing requirements on building owners to assess and improve the energy performance of non-domestic buildings with floor areas greater than 1,000 square metres that were not constructed to the 2002 building standards or later. The regulations apply to rented dwellings and non-dwellings in England and Wales. All buildings that are currently required to have an EPC are in scope. Now, if a building or part of a building was not required to obtain an EPC under existing regulations, e.g. it's due to be demolished, then the private rented property regulations will not apply. In addition, properties occupied under license and those with short leases of 6 months or less, or very long leases of 99 years or more, are also outside of scope. Listed buildings will have exemptions. However, the scope of this is to be further defined in the guidance which is yet to be published. Properties in scope will need to reach a minimum E EPC rating or above. Now, 1 in 10 domestic properties and 18% of non-domestic properties currently have a rating of F or G. It's the landlord's duty to ensure the property reaches an E EPC rating. For non-domestic properties, the landlord can examine the lease and may decide to negotiate with their tenant over who undertakes and finances the work. And there are exemptions that landlords may be eligible for in relation to meeting this minimum standard. With regard to cost and finances, landlords may be eligible for an exemption from reaching an E rating where they can show the property has installed all cost-effective measures available. The cost effectiveness has been confined to those measures that can be financed within a 7-year payback period. It requires installation of improvements that are expected to deliver the same or more in energy bill savings within the 7 years. The cost of purchasing and installing measures are used when determining whether the property is eligible for such an exemption. The exemption is a temporary one and expires after 5 years, at which time the landlord will be required to reassess the cost effectiveness and make improvements if it's possible for the measures to meet the 7-year rule. A landlord may also be eligible for an exemption where it cannot obtain required consents or permissions for the improvement work required to bring the EPC to the required standard. This can be either that finance is proposed but consent is not given for the works to be carried out, or consent is provided with unreasonable conditions that make it impossible for the landlord to complete the work. The exemption lasts for 5 years unless it relates to an occupying tenant denying consent, in which case it ceases once they vacate the property, if it is sooner. The exemption is again a temporary one, and after 5 years the landlord will be required to reapply to the tenant to make improvements, and the exemption can only remain in place if these conditions are met. Another temporary exemption is in relation to devaluation or damage to the property. So landlords are eligible for an exemption where they can show that a qualified expert has provided written advice that the measures required to improve the EPC will reduce a property's value by 5% or more. The valuation assessment must be undertaken by a RICS qualified valuer. The property damage assessment must be undertaken by a building conservation independent architect, chartered engineer, chartered building surveyor, or chartered architectural technologist. This exemption is also valid for 5 years, after which time the process must be repeated to ensure that the assessment remains valid. The penalties for non-compliance of the non-domestic regulations depend on the period that the landlord remains in breach. So for renting out a non-compliant property for a period of less than 3 months, the fine is 10% of the rateable value, with a minimum fine of £5,000 and a maximum of £50,000. For renting out a non-compliant property for a period of more than 3 months, the fine is 20% of the rateable value, with a minimum fine of £10,000 and a maximum of £150,000. For providing false or misleading information or failing to comply with a compliance notice, the fine is set at £5,000. It's important to note that the regulations cannot prevent the landlord from renting out the property. However, the fines will be imposed and published for non-compliance. The penalties for non-compliance of the domestic regulations again depend on the period that the landlord remains in breach. So for renting out a non-compliant property for a period of less than 3 months, the maximum fine is £2,000. and for a period of more than 3 months it's £4,000. For providing false or misleading information, the fine is set at £1,000, and for failing to comply with a compliance notice, the fine is £2,000. Again, non-compliance will be published. The EPC regulations for Scotland came into force on the 1st of September 2016, placing requirements on building owners for the assessment and improvement of energy performance of non-domestic buildings with a floor area of more than 1,000 square metres that are not constructed to the 2002 building standards or later. From the 1st of April 2018, it'll become unlawful to issue a lease to a new or existing tenant for both domestic and non-domestic landlords, unless the building has an EPC of E or above, unless any exemption applies. Exemptions must be recorded on the exemptions register. From the 1st of April 2020, all domestic properties that have existing leases must have an EPC of E or above, or the landlord will be non-compliant. The deadline for compliance for non-domestic properties with existing leases is the 1st of April 2023. Again, where exemptions apply, they must be recorded on the exemptions register. The introduction of this legislation has had an impact on asset value in a number of ways, and landlords and investors can no longer avoid the fact that sustainability and energy performance has an economic impact when it comes to property, in terms of property value and rental income. The impact on property value is clear. Unlettable buildings will lose value as no tenants means no rental income. Therefore, the property becomes worthless other than for redevelopment. This legislation is forcing landlords to act to improve the energy performance of properties to prevent sustainable obsolescence. Such is the importance of the EPC on property value that the RICS guidelines do not permit valuers to submit a valuation without sight of the property's EPC and accounting for this in the valuation. What's also interesting is that there's evidence that both tenants and investors alike are sitting up and taking note of EPC scores, and not just landlords. The former when selecting their office of choice, and the latter when making investment decisions. As a result, whilst the government has set the minimum energy efficiency standard at a grade E EPC, the market is raising the bar, with many investors refusing to lend on any properties with an EPC grade lower than a D, or in some cases a C. And likewise, tenants are looking to lease premises grades which are higher than the legal minimum standard. The former Department of Energy and Climate Change commissioned an investigation into the effect of EPC ratings on house prices in 2013, which concluded that there's a positive relationship between energy rating and property price per square metre. The report states that compared to dwellings rated EPC Band G, dwellings with higher EPC ratings have sold at a statistically significant price premium, and the pattern of the results is consistent and plausible. As expected, the price difference increases as EPC performance improves. We estimate that compared to dwellings rated EPC G, dwellings rated EPC F and E are sold for approximately 6% more, dwellings rated D sold for 8% more, and dwellings rated EPC Band C for 10%, and AB sold for 14% more. So initial analysis of the available data suggests the same to be true of commercial properties. We've conducted a study into the link between EPC scores and the rental income achieved on commercial office property in the UK. An analysis has been undertaken of the EPC scores attained and the rental income per square metre for each property, using data from the CoStar database. This data has been used to calculate the average rent achieved for each EPC band in each area, to establish whether there's any quantitative evidence of the impact EPCs are having on rental income. The 4 cities selected for review were London, Birmingham, Manchester and Newcastle, and the analysis has been broken down by sub-markets within each city. The results of our analysis conclude that there is some correlation between rents achieved and EPC score, with average rents being higher the better the EPC score. When the analysis is broken down to submarkets within the cities, there are some outliers, particularly in pockets in London where property value remains high irrespective of external factors. Mayfair is a classic example of this. However, in general, the trend can be seen that average rent correlates with the EPC score. This trend's displayed most prominently in Birmingham and Manchester, with London being skewed by a higher number of outliers due to the nature of the property market in the capital. As a result of the link between EPCs and asset value and the need for a good EPC grade, it seems today that there's an art to the production to ensure that companies attain the best possible score. Gone are the days of just ticking the compliance box as far as EPCs are concerned in order to secure a sale or letting. Now, the introduction of the minimum energy efficiency standard means that today's EPC is all about quality and strategy to maximize the rating and protect asset value. Although EPCs have been in existence for almost a decade, it's only in the last 12 months that companies have woken up to the importance of the EPC rating, and the drive is now on to get the best possible score ahead of the 2018 deadline. In some instances, upgrade works are the only option to hit the target grade, and some will require sustainable investment as well as detailed planning to minimize disruption to tenants. Landlords must act now to ensure that works can be properly budgeted for and delivered by the 2018 deadline. So when thinking about the EPC for your property, there are now many factors to consider and a strategy has to be formulated. Failure to act puts buildings at risk of substantial obsolescence. There are a number of strategic factors which need to be employed to mitigate risk and maximize opportunities for energy, cost, and carbon saving in respect to EPCs for commercial properties. This starts with the need to understand the current EPC score. Over time, EPC scores are generally deteriorating, and this is because the software used to produce EPCs is updated in line with building regulations, which are becoming more stringent over time. Therefore, a building which scored an E grade 7 years ago would likely score below an E grade today, assuming no changes have been made to the property. We've seen some buildings which previously attained a D or even C grade drop below an E on the latest software. The most significant reclassification occurred in 2011, and so EPC grades attained before 2011 should not be relied on when assessing the risk across a portfolio. EPCs were introduced to the UK 8 years ago, and a number of lessons have been learnt since their introduction. The lessons learnt allow us to plan strategically for assessing risk. As of May 2015, over 13 million residential EPCs have been completed and over 500,000 commercial, representing 40% of all commercial stock. The average grade across all of these EPCs is a D. Now, electricity has a higher carbon emission factor than gas per kilowatt hour. As a result, buildings with electricity-intensive air conditioning systems often perform most poorly in terms of EPC grades. Building age also has a significant impact on EPC score, as building regulations have been updated over time to increase the minimum standard for energy performance for new builds, so these naturally perform better. The starting point in developing a strategic EPC plan is to undertake a portfolio risk analysis. Firstly, any properties which already have an EPC falling below the minimum standard need to be identified, as these present an immediate threat. Secondly, for any building where an EPC does not exist, this needs to be produced, at least in draft, in order to assess the risk. The final step in the risk analysis is to review the completion dates for the EPCs and decide which of those that previously scored an E, D or C grade could be at risk today due to the software updates. Of course, if buildings have had improvement works to any of the fixed heating, ventilation and air conditioning services, lighting or building fabric, they may see an improvement in EPC grade, or at least have limited any deterioration in score. So there are a number of key characteristics of properties which are known to cause the worst EPC scores. Some of the poorest scores come from properties with inefficient building fabric. Properties formed of single brick construction, single glazing and poor insulation generally find themselves down in the G grade banding. Installation of secondary glazing or double glazing and good insulation are key upgrade measures for improvements. The type of HVAC system installed also has a big impact on EPC rating. Classic 1980s and 1990s properties with large central air conditioning systems are very energy intensive, and this is reflected on EPC scores. Building design in this era focused on providing occupiers with the latest technologies, but systems were overspec'd and little thought was given to energy efficiency during that period. Whilst it's well understood that older and less efficient systems generally receive the lowest scores, it's clear that some building service system types have fared particularly poorly under the software changes. We've seen the EPC ratings for some properties with air-cooled air conditioning systems change significantly. Variable air volume systems appear to be by far the worst offenders under the software changes, and with several properties with VAV systems falling by as much as 2 or 3 ratings when run on the latest software. Understanding the systems in buildings across your portfolio can highlight the areas which need focus first and the likelihood of scores dropping significantly from pre-2011 EPCs. Upgrade of HVAC systems can be very costly and not always feasible. A number of properties have demonstrated that sometimes the upgrade of lighting to LEDs across the site can be a more cost-effective way of improving the EPC rating without altering the HVAC systems. There are 3 levels of EPC for commercial buildings, and the correct level is required to be selected dependent on the complexity and sophistication of heating, ventilation and air conditioning, HVAC systems. Level 3 EPCs are used for simple buildings with a heating capacity of less than 100 kilowatts and a cooling capacity of less than 12 kilowatts, with Level 4 used where system capacities exceed these thresholds and with more complex centralized air conditioning systems. A small number of commercial buildings with very complex systems require a Level 5 EPC, which uses dynamic simulation modeling to account for these complexities. Level 5 EPCs are required for buildings which have an atrium, automatic blind control or curved glass. Now, although this requirement exists, we've seen a number of buildings which fall under the requirement for a Level 5 EPC, but where Level 4 EPCs have been commissioned using techniques to get round the requirements for Level 5 in an audit to simply tick the compliance box. However, the sophistication of a Level 5 EPC model allows the input of more granular data, which in turn allows identification of some of the nuances which are masked in a more simplified model. This helps to highlight those investment options which can achieve the required score at the lowest expenditure to gain a favourable financial return. Some of these nuances would not have been detected on the Level 4 EPC, and as such, different upgrade decisions would have been made, which could have been more costly. So for this reason, Level 5 EPCs may be considered on larger, complex buildings, even if the property does not meet the criteria of having an atrium, automatic blinds or curved glass. Not only does this open more opportunities in terms of analysing the actions that can be taken to improve the score, but given that investors are now more switched on to the quality of EPCs, the use of a Level 4 EPC where a Level 5 should be used could hold up a building sale. So when producing an EPC where certain information is not available, default values are used, which assume worst case scenario. So before investing in upgrade measures, ensure the EPC is as accurate as possible, as improved accuracy sometimes results in an improved score by mitigating the use of these default values. To avoid the use of defaults, it's important to track down the required data and provide suitable evidence so this can be used within the model. Before undertaking any upgrade works which require capital investment, it's therefore important to ensure that the EPC is as accurate as it can be and reduce the number of any default values applied. Improved accuracy does not necessarily mean an improved score, but in some cases it can help push the score up a few points, and where EPCs are at the top end of a band could be the difference between a lower and a higher grade. Spending time working with your EPC assessor to ensure the information required is available can save expense later down the line, as for every point you can improve the score, the lesser the extent of capital upgrade work required. Some of the common areas where we've been able to make improvements by ensuring the most accurate information is used are as follows. For starters, air permeability. Where air tightness test results are not available, the software has to assume an air permeability figure based on the age and construction of the property. Use your draft EPC model to assess whether an improved air permeability score would have any worthwhile impact on the EPC, and if it does, consider investing in an air tightness check to test whether the actual performance is better than the software assumed figures. Next, lighting. When producing EPC models, these are typically produced using lighting type, for example T5 fluorescent lamp or LEDs. However, there are hundreds of different T5s and LEDs on the market, and so again the software makes some assumptions as to the typical efficacy of the lamps. Investing in a detailed lighting survey to record the specifics of lamp types and working out the actual lumens per circuit watt will give a more accurate picture. If this is better than the software assumed figures, it will again help to improve the EPC score. Upgrade works. Think about any upgrade works which have been undertaken in the building since the original service installation and ensure the most up-to-date information is being used. In most cases, upgrade works generally result in equipment with improved efficiency due to advances in technology over time. But often plant details can be difficult to find, and operation and maintenance manuals are not always updated to reflect the new equipment. Having attained the most accurate EPC you can, the next stage is to develop an EPC improvement plan for any property which still falls at risk under the 2018 MEES deadline. Consider energy efficiency improvements which could be made to the property and work with your EPC assessor to understand how this could impact on the EPC score. Furthermore, understand the capital expenditure required to achieve the upgrade, as well as the estimated annual energy saving, in order that a simple payback can be calculated, as the benefit is twofold: financial savings due to reduced energy consumption and an improved EPC score, which can help to maintain or improve asset value. Once any required upgrade works have been implemented, these will need to be witnessed by the EPC assessor. The EPC model can then be rerun and the new EPC lodged. The EPC is then valid for 10 years. The Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy will issue guidelines to enable landlords to comply with the regulations. The guidance for compliance with the Energy Efficiency, Private Rented Property, England and Wales Regulations 2015 has yet to be released, and a date for this has not been announced. In the meantime, it's important for landlords and property managers to be prepared by understanding the risks which exist across their property portfolios and developing EPC improvement plans where risk is high. As outlined, there are a number of ways that risk can be assessed, and spending time ensuring EPCs are accurate could save on costly upgrade works later down the line. Thank you.